Hi everyone, welcome to today's meditation. When I was in seminary, my thesis in my third year was on preaching to pain. I chose this topic because a lot of times the painful texts in the Bible were not preached in the pulpit. Mostly because when people go to church, they want to be comforted and reminded of God's faithfulness, steadfastness, and maybe they've had a hard week and they don't always want to hear about these painful texts in the Bible. But what I often found was that when painful things happen to people, death of a loved one, a car accident, miscarriage and infertility, that people could not talk about them at church. They felt it was inappropriate because it's never talked about in the pulpit. And so my thesis explored that a little bit. Today's text is one such example. Our character's name is Rizpah. She is in the book of 2 Samuel. Now, Rizpah was a secondary wife to Saul. She had children with Saul, and secondary wives were very common in those days. And it basically meant that children were still legitimate, but they often didn't receive inheritance. And we first meet Rizpah in the transition between Saul and David's monarchy, which was not smooth by any means. It was 2 years of political backstabbing and scheming and wrestling for power. And at this point, I'm in 2 Samuel chapter 3. David is king of Judah, and Ishbaal, Saul's son, is king of Israel. One character that we meet in our first encounter with Rizpah is Abner. Abner is a real snake of a person, commander of Saul's army, who will quickly turn on you and lie. And Ishbaal accuses Abner of raping Rizpah. And sleeping with a king's wife, first or second, is equal to claiming the throne. And women's bodies were often used as tools during this time, tools to grab power with. So 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 6 through 11. While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine, whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And Ishbaal said to Abner, "Why have you gone in to my father's concubine?" The words of Ishbaal made Abner very angry. He said, "Am I a dog's head for Judah? Today I keep showing loyalty to the house of your father Saul, to his brothers, and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me now with a crime concerning this woman. So may God do to Abner, and so may he add to it. For just what the Lord has sworn to David, that I will accomplish for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba." And Ishbaal could not answer Abner another word, because he feared him. So we notice in that passage that Abner does not deny the crime necessarily, but he instead uses Ishbaal's accusation as a reason to change sides and present Israel to David. Rizpah isn't given any voice in the story, and Abner gets away with his crime. But Rizpah's story does not end there. We meet her again in chapter 21. David is king at this point, but there has been a famine in the land for 3 years, and so David goes to God to ask him what to do to fix this famine. So this is chapter 21. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord. The Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had tried to wipe them out in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make expiation, that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul and his house, neither is it for us to put anyone to death in Israel." He said, "What do you say that I should do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord." The king said, "I will hand them over." But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai the Mehotholite. It's quite a mouthful. He gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they impaled them on the mountain before the Lord. The 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest at the beginning of barley harvest. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock for herself from the beginning of harvest until rain fell on them from the heavens. She did not allow the birds of the air to come on the bodies by day, or the wild animals by night. When David was told what Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the people of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up on the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. He brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who had been impaled on the mountain. They buried the bones of Saul and of his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin and Zelah, in the tomb of his father Kish. They did all that the king commanded. After that, God heeded supplications for the land. So God tells David that the reason for the famine is the blood guilt on Saul's house for Saul's murder of the Gibeonites. And David goes to the remaining tribe family members, and they ask for some kind of bloodshed in Saul's family in return. David, believing that this is what God is asking for, then orders Saul's 7 descendants, with the exception of Jonathan's son, be given to the Gibeonites to be killed. So Rizpah's 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, as well as 5 of Saul's grandsons, are taken and lynched on a mountain for all to see. What amazes me here is Rizpah's response. Some in her situation would have deemed themselves powerless, mourned quietly, and disappeared in the fabric of the Bible. A lot of times when people are killed in the Bible, it never talks about how it affects their family members. But Rizpah refuses to go away quietly. She asserts her power, and she goes up on that mountain and makes a home with the bodies. She lives with their decaying stench and protects them from the vultures and the crows day and night. She does not sleep. And our text tells us that she's there from the beginning of the barley harvest, which is in spring, until rain fell in late autumn. She lives up there with her sons and relatives' bodies for 6 months. She refuses to let people forget this injustice that has happened to her family. She refuses to let her son's murders be a quiet affair, just another casualty in politics and the mistake of a king. She refuses to let murder be normalized, and she puts her deep, deep grief on display for all to see, and she does not care if others are uncomfortable. And Rizpah's public 6-month lament moves David. We're not sure if he realizes his mistake, but he sees how his decision has affected the well-being of a person. It makes him remember his own lament, the death of his beloved Jonathan and the death of Saul. He remembers their bodies were never given a proper burial. He goes and retrieves their bones and gathers the bones of Rizpah's sons and their half-brothers and gives them a proper burial. Rizpah can teach us a lesson in today's world. Too often, we want to turn our eyes away from the horrible injustices that people face, because lament is a tough place to stay in. We often don't want to hear about it because it makes our world a darker place. But Rizpah reminds us that injustice should not be dealt quietly. Injustice, murder, wrongdoing should be put on public display, with those of us standing in the face of our lament, saying, "This is not right," loud enough and long enough, until those in power turn their eyes toward the people they have wronged and make amends. We have mothers like Rizpah in our world today. You've probably seen them on the news. The mother of Michael Brown, the mother of George Floyd, the mother-in-law of Rayshard Brooks, the family of Trayford Pelowin, Tamir Rice's mother. The list goes on and on for way too long. Mothers, wives, family members who have lost their loved one, who was shot when they did nothing wrong. 14-year-old Emmett Till was murdered 65 years ago on Friday. He was beaten, disfigured, and murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman. He was disfigured so badly that he could only be identified by an initialed ring. He was 14. His murderers were found not guilty. But Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Bradley, insisted on having an open casket at Emmett's funeral, wanting the world to see what unchecked hatred looks like. She wanted this body of her son to be on display as a public lament, saying, "Look what hatred and racism did to my son. Don't look away. This is what they did." And they got away with it. There is a lot to lament in our world today. And at times it may feel like if we truly lamented every single act of injustice, it would break us apart. And so often we look away, or worse, we demean those who are crying out against injustice. Or worse, we come up with some terrible excuse for that injustice. But Rizpah shows us how personal justice is, how it upended her entire life, how her two pride and joys were killed for some blood guilt to be satisfied when they did nothing wrong. When so many people of color are shot and killed by police, more than white people, we should be outraged. We should be outraged that a black man, was shot 7 times in the back for breaking up a fight, and a 17-year-old white man is allowed to walk around freely with an assault weapon and kills 2 protesters. We should be outraged when people ask, well, what did the man do wrong, when they hear about a black man who was shot and killed. We should never watch lives be taken and accept it as normal. We should never see Rizpah up on that mountain, living with the corpses of her son, and not be heartbroken about it. We should be thinking of our own loved ones and how it would feel if they were killed for doing nothing wrong, and be grieving with those mourning their deaths. Sitting in lament is hard, especially during this year. But dismissing injustice and murder is worse. Oftentimes we want to turn away from feeling these laments because it's easier. But Pastor Ann summed up the importance of lamenting in her pastoral letter this past week. And if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do so. When we lament, it doesn't feel great, but it highlights important things about ourselves. It shows how much we value life, creation, health, morality, justice. It shows how much love we have in our lives, that we are shattered when it is lost. Lament shows that we have a huge capacity to love and to help make the world a better place. And lament shows the rest of the world, especially those in power, that real life and death consequences come from hatred, bigotry, and violence. Lament lets the world know that we can do better than this, and hatred will not be tolerated. And without lament, we can't have hope, because they come from the same place in ourselves. If you have found yourself trying to turn off your grief and turn away from injustices that happen, you'll find yourself turned off from happiness, love, and hope as well. You can't turn off one emotion and not turn off the rest. You'll find that your world will become much more cynical and gray when we try to turn away. Those 2 emotions of lament and hope, they go hand in hand. I know it's been a hard week, and it's been a very hard year. But I beg you not to turn away when people cry out against injustice. I beg you to feel empathy for the Rizpahs of our world, and let their public grief move you to action like David. To not see those lynched bodies, those shot bodies, and turn away because it's easier. I ask you not to turn away, but to turn in instead. To step into the shoes of those who have lost their loved ones to racial violence. And be vocal about where you stand, especially with those who try to turn away themselves, or those who demean the grieving. To never, ever, ever, ever let murder be normalized in your worldview. And to never say, it's not my problem. If you struggle with this a lot, or you're struggling with what I'm saying, I encourage you, come talk to me about it. Send me an email. I would be happy to try to pick this apart with you. Lamenting injustice is too important for us to turn off our grief. And things in this world will only change for the better when we fully embrace and lament the hatred and the violence that's in this world. That's the only way things will change. When we lament the grief of the Rizpahs in our world and be vocal about it, that's how we make a difference in this world. I know this is a hard sermon and probably not one that you wanted to hear. I'm sorry I haven't made you feel comforted tonight. But the character of Rizpah really spoke to my spirit this week as something to talk about. How her actions are such a role model for us. To never let injustice just happen. As we go into our new week, we always pray that it's better than the last. But I hope that you can lean into those feelings of lament. To be careful to not let murder and violence become normal. It's not. To stand with our brothers and sisters of color who are asking us to not turn away from injustice. Will you try that with me? I hope so. Blessings on you, those who are watching. Peace and love to you this week. I wish I was with you in person. Amen, and take care.